The chill of the University Medical School cadaver storage facility was a familiar comfort, a constant hum against the quiet reverence I held for the silent storytellers on the steel tables. I ran a gloved finger along the parietal bone of a specimen, its surface smooth as polished ivory, marred only by the subtle sutural lines of age. This particular individual, a woman likely in her late 60s, had been donated decades ago, her skeleton a testament to osteoporosis and a life of moderate labor. I was mapping microfractures, piecing together a narrative of minor traumas and the slow, inevitable creep of time. This was my world, deciphering the past from bone, finding the individual within the anonymity of death. My phone, vibrating against the sterile steel tray beside a set of calipers, shattered the stillness. I pulled off my gloves, the synthetic material peeling away with a soft hiss. The caller ID showed a number I recognized, belonging to the lead investigator on cold cases, a detective with a gravelly voice and an even graver demeanor. "Seth here," I answered, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "Finch is dead," the detective stated, no preamble, no pleasantries. "Alistair Finch. At Blackwood Manor." My grip tightened on the phone. Dr. Alistair Finch was more than just a name. He was a celebrated historian, a public intellectual whose work on forgotten civilizations had reshaped our understanding of antiquity. Blackwood Manor, his ancestral home, was a legend in its own right, a sprawling, Gothic estate steeped in local lore, its foundations reportedly dating back to the colonial era, with additions from every subsequent century. It was a repository of history, much like the bones I studied, but alive, breathing with stories. "What happened?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. Finch was notoriously reclusive, a man who guarded his privacy with the same fierce intensity he applied to historical fact. "Appears he fell," the detective continued. "From the main gallery, down the grand staircase. Local authorities are calling it accidental. But, given who he was, and the manor's reputation, my superintendent wants a second set of eyes." "Your eyes, specifically." My mind immediately conjured images of the manor's notorious central hall, a cavernous space dominated by a sweeping, cantilevered staircase that spiraled upwards, seemingly without support, to a gallery overlooking the main entrance. A fall from there would be catastrophic. "I'll pack my kit," I confirmed, already moving towards my locker. The sterile air of the facility suddenly felt too thin. This was fresh, raw, and touched the living world directly. The drive to Blackwood Manor was long, winding through forgotten country roads that narrowed into overgrown lanes, the canopy of ancient oaks eventually blotting out the late afternoon sun. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The manor itself emerged from a shroud of mist, a formidable silhouette against a bruised sky. Turrets and gables clawed at the clouds, and ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the stone, slowly reclaiming the edifice. It looked less like a home and more like a sleeping colossus, burdened by the weight of its own history. A uniformed officer stood guard near the massive oak front doors, his face grim. He nodded to me, his gaze wary, as I stepped out of my vehicle, my forensic kit bag slung over my shoulder. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the creak of ancient timbers and the distant drip of water. The air was cool, carrying the faint, earthy scent of old books and dust. My boots clicked on the polished marble floor of the grand hall, each step echoing through the cavernous space. The detective, a burly man named Miller, met me at the foot of the magnificent staircase, his face etched with fatigue. "Seth." "Thanks for coming," Miller said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured vaguely upwards. "He went over the railing, apparently. He was found him here, at the bottom." I surveyed the scene. The grand staircase, an architectural marvel, dominated the hall. Yellow evidence markers dotted the marble floor, tracing the approximate final resting place of Dr. Finch. A forensics team, already packing up their gear, moved with practiced efficiency, their hushed movements a stark contrast to the grandeur of their surroundings. "Preliminary assessment is a tragic accident," Miller continued, lowering his voice further. "He was known to take a drink or two, especially after a long day of research. Must have lost his footing." I walked closer, my gaze sweeping over the scene. I knelt, pulling out my magnifying glass and a small LED flashlight. My eyes traced the faint scuff marks on the lowest steps, the subtle abrasions on the marble itself. "Where's the body?" I asked, standing up. The local coroner was efficient. Said there was nothing more to see here. My brow furrowed. Efficient, perhaps, but premature. A body tells a story, a crucial part of the scene that should ideally be examined in situ. Still, I could work with what I had. I ascended the broad steps, my gloved hands brushing lightly against the railing. It was solid, heavy ironwork, not something easily broken or dislodged. At the gallery level, where the fall supposedly began, I moved slowly, methodically. The railing here was waist-high, sturdy. To fall over it, Finch would have had to exert considerable force, or be severely incapacitated. I examined the floor near the railing. Dust, thick and undisturbed in most places, offered a silent chronology. But near the edge, I noticed a subtle disturbance. Not a scuff, but a slight, almost imperceptible smear in the dust, as if something had been dragged. It was faint, easily missed, less than an inch long. And then, my eyes caught it. Tucked into a tiny crevice in the ornate wooden base of the railing, barely visible without a direct light source, was a fragment of material. I carefully extracted it with tweezers, dropping it into a sterile evidence bag. It felt like dried parchment, but with an odd, almost metallic sheen. It certainly wasn't common fabric, nor did it look like anything from the manor's known decor. I continued my sweep, my senses heightened. The gallery was lined with bookshelves, overflowing with ancient tomes, their leather bindings cracked and brittle. On a small side table, amidst a scattering of research papers and a half-empty teacup, I found another anomaly. A faint, almost invisible residue clung to the edge of a heavy, brass magnifying glass. I scraped a tiny sample into another bag. It shimmered faintly under my light, a fine, glittering dust, unlike anything I'd ever encountered in a domestic setting. It wasn't plaster, not wood dust, not even the patina of aged metal. It was alien. I descended the stairs, the weight of my observations pressing down on me. The official story of an accidental fall was beginning to fray in my mind, unraveling thread by minute thread. Alistair Finch might have been a renowned historian, but the history I was beginning to uncover here felt far more recent, and far more sinister. The drive from the manor to the city felt longer than it was, the estate's isolation amplifying the unsettling quiet of my thoughts. The decision to remove the historians remained so swiftly still grated, a crucial piece of the narrative ripped from its context. But I was a pragmatist. If the scene couldn't speak, the body would have to scream its secrets louder. It was late, the campus mostly deserted, giving the building an even more imposing, almost mausoleum-like quality under the streetlights. Inside, the air was a sterile, frigid balm, a scent of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and final, clinging to the quiet corridors. A lone security officer nodded curtly as I signed in, his gaze lingering on my specialized equipment cases. The room was functional, devoid of warmth or personality, stainless steel tables, bright overhead lights, an array of instruments gleaming under glass. The historian, Dr. Finch, lay beneath a white sheet on the central table. I took a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the harsh light, letting the silence settle around me. This was where the real work began, where the stories whispered by bone and tissue became audible. I stripped down to scrubs, pulled on fresh gloves, a mask, and a face shield. My kit was laid out with practiced precision, magnifying lamps, various tweezers, scalpels, collection vials, a high-resolution camera, and a portable microscope. With a deep breath, I drew back the sheet. Dr. Finch looked smaller here, removed from the grandeur of his estate. His face, pale and still, bore the faint purpling of post-mortem lividity, but no obvious trauma. The initial assessment from the local authorities cited a fall, and superficially, the injuries seemed to align, contusions on the left side of his body, consistent with impact on the stone balustrade and then the ground below. A fractured tibia, a probable concussion. I began with his clothing. Each garment was meticulously removed, photographed, and bagged. The tweed jacket, though rumpled, showed no tears beyond what a fall might cause. His trousers, however, presented the first subtle anomaly. On the inner thigh, near the seam, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration. Under the magnifying lamp, it resolved into a fine, granular dust. I used a micro-vacuum to collect a sample, then transferred a pinch to a slide for immediate examination under my portable microscope. The particles shimmered, angular and crystalline, reflecting the light with an unusual iridescence. This wasn't dust from the estate's ancient books, nor garden soil, nor common household grit. The color, a deep, almost purplish gray, was striking. I spent several minutes rotating the slide, comparing the visual characteristics to known mineralogical structures I'd encountered in various excavation sites. This was unique. I hadn't seen anything quite like it in the region, certainly not around the manor. It suggested a different origin entirely, a foreign substance introduced from elsewhere. The dust was too fine, too embedded in the fabric to be a casual transfer. It spoke of proximity, perhaps a struggle, or contact with something unexpected. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. I moved to the body itself. The external examination was thorough, inch by painstaking inch. I noted the abrasions on his hands, the scrapes on his elbows. Most were superficial, consistent with an uncontrolled descent. But then I focused on the left wrist. A small, almost invisible abrasion, crescent-shaped, near the base of the thumb. It was too clean, too precise for a random scrape against stone. It looked like a pressure mark, perhaps from a grip. Next, the skeletal structure. I systematically palpated each bone, searching for any subtle shifts or breaks. The tibia fracture was clear, a spiral break indicative of twisting force, consistent with a fall. Not a complete fracture, nothing that would have been immediately obvious without this level of scrutiny. Instead, two hairline fractures on the anterior aspect of the third and fourth ribs, just lateral to the sternum. They were tiny, almost microscopic, barely discernible even to my trained fingers. These fractures were different from the tibia. They weren't consistent with the impact trajectory of a fall onto the balustrade or the ground. A fall, especially one from a height, would typically result in more widespread, crushing injuries to the chest, or fractures on the posterior ribs from landing on the back. These anterior hairline fractures suggested a direct, localized force, a sharp impact from the front, perhaps a blow, or a forceful compression. They were the kind of fractures you might see from a sudden, violent shove against a hard, narrow object, or even a knee to the chest. My jaw tightened. The pieces clicked into place, not yet forming a complete picture, but certainly painting a different one than the local authorities had sketched. The unique mineral dust, foreign to the estate, nestled in the fabric of his clothing. The crescent-shaped abrasion on his wrist, hinting at restraint or a struggle. Finch hadn't simply stumbled. He had been pushed, or struck, or perhaps both. The official narrative was collapsing under the weight of these undeniable truths. This was no accident. This was murder. And the secrets buried within these bones, within that strange dust, were just beginning to surface. The path ahead, I knew, would be anything but straightforward. But I was a pragmatist. If the scene was compromised, I would rebuild it from the fragments I could recover. My immediate focus, the mineral dust. The building was a brutalist block of concrete and smoked glass, designed for function over aesthetics. Inside, the air was cool, dry, and carried that distinctive, metallic tang of preservation chemicals, layered with something sterile and clinical. It wasn't the antiseptic scent of a traditional medical facility, but something far more specialized, more focused on long-term study than immediate care. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors, my steps echoing on the polished linoleum, until I reached the secure examination room. The room itself was a tableau of stainless steel and bright, overhead fluorescence. The historian's remains lay on a gurney, shrouded under a pristine white sheet. My gaze lingered on the areas where I'd found the peculiar dust. I began my meticulous work, using a high-powered stereo microscope. The dust, visible now as tiny, glittering specks, adhered stubbornly to the fabric of the historian's clothes, caught in the creases of his skin, even embedded lightly in his hair. I carefully collected samples with microtweezers and adhesive lifts, placing each into individually labeled vials. This wasn't just dirt, it had a crystalline structure, a specific hue that hinted at a geological origin I couldn't quite place from memory alone. Later, in a small, well-equipped laboratory attached to the facility, I worked alongside a geological analyst, a quiet, precise woman who specialized in trace mineral identification. She operated a sophisticated electron microscope, projecting magnified images of my samples onto a large screen. "Fascinating," she murmured, adjusting a knob. "See the inclusions? And the fracture patterns. It's a very specific silicate. Low in iron, high in quartz, with traces of..." "Well, that's unusual." "Unusual how?" I pressed, leaning closer to the screen. The image shimmered, revealing an alien landscape of crystalline facets. "It's a specific variant of a mineral found predominantly in a particular igneous formation," she explained, her finger tracing a contour on the screen. "A very old one. Remote. I've only seen samples from a few known sites, mostly in the Northern Highlands, near that old Roman settlement dig." My mind immediately clicked. The Northern Highlands. Finch had been obsessed with that region lately, publishing obscure papers on localized geological anomalies, hinting at potential undiscovered sites. He'd even mentioned a personal research trip to a remote area just a few weeks ago, an area notorious for its difficult terrain and lack of official archaeological interest. The geologist confirmed my suspicion when she cross-referenced the mineral signature with known geological maps. The coordinates she gave me pointed to a swath of land miles from any paved road, a place marked on older charts as unsurveyed uplands. It was exactly the kind of location Finch would have sought out for unsanctioned work. The determination solidified in my gut. I had to see this place. Tracking down Dr. Finch's estranged research assistant took me a full day. I found her in a quiet, sun-dappled cafe near the university's main campus, hunched over a laptop, nursing a lukewarm coffee. Her name was Maya, and she looked tired, her eyes shadowed, her usually vibrant red hair a little dull. When I introduced myself, her shoulders visibly tensed. "I don't know anything about Dr. Finch's accident, Professor," she said, her voice tight, avoiding my gaze. "I haven't worked for him in weeks." "I'm not asking about an accident, Maya," I said, my voice low, intentionally calm. I slid a small, clear vial across the table. Inside, a tiny pinch of the mineral dust glittered. "Do you recognize this?" She glanced at it, her expression flickering from apprehension to a flicker of something like fear. "It's from the field. From the northern projects. The unsanctioned ones," I clarified. "The ones Dr. Finch was so secretive about." She swallowed, her gaze darting around the cafe, as if expecting to be overheard. "He became difficult. Obsessed. He was convinced there was something hidden up there. Something nobody else had found." "A lost artifact?" I prompted, remembering Finch's historical focus. She nodded, her eyes finally meeting mine, wide with a mixture of exasperation and genuine unease. "He called it the Chronos Stone. Said it was the key to everything. He started having these meetings. Not with colleagues, not with academics. He'd come back looking electrified or terrified. He started talking about preserving a legacy. Not his own, but something ancient. Something powerful. I thought he was losing his mind. That's when I left." She took a shaky breath. "He warned me not to talk about it. Said it would be dangerous." The air in the cafe, moments ago light and convivial, now felt heavy, charged with unspoken threats. Finch hadn't just been obsessed, he'd been entangled. I had a feeling my journey was just beginning. The air in the cafe, moments ago light and convivial, now felt heavy, charged with unspoken threats. Maya's fear had been palpable, a cold, creeping sensation that mirrored the unease growing in my own gut. Finch hadn't just been obsessed, he'd been entangled. And the lost artifact wasn't just a relic, it was the anchor of this deepening storm. I needed to see the estate again, not for the obvious, but for what Finch might have been hiding beneath the surface. I drove back to the estate grounds the next morning, the mist still clinging to the ancient oaks like spectral shrouds. The gate, once imposing, now felt less like a barrier and more like an invitation into a secret, decaying world. The grounds stretched out, a patchwork of manicured lawns giving way to overgrown thickets where Finch's unauthorized dig site lay. The official investigation had focused on the manor house, on the tragic fall. My focus, however, was shifting to the soil itself, to the secrets it might hold. The path to the dig site was a winding track, barely visible beneath a layer of fallen leaves and damp earth. As I approached, a familiar scent hit me, fresh soil, but with an underlying metallic tang, subtle but distinct. It wasn't the smell of natural decomposition or undisturbed earth. My boots crunched on brittle twigs, and then, on something else. A faint glint caught my eye. I knelt, brushing aside a handful of wet leaves, and found a small, discarded spade, its edge still sharp, not the kind of tool one would leave behind if the work was truly finished. Further in, a section of earth near a partially excavated trench looked too uniform, too recently disturbed. It wasn't just old digging, someone had been here, recently, and they'd been careful to cover their tracks. Too careful. My gaze swept over the site. Finch's meticulous grid lines were still faintly visible, marked by pegs and twine, but in one corner, near a cluster of gnarled roots, the ground had been clearly turned over, then loosely backfilled. It lacked the compaction of older earth, the natural settling. I pulled a trowel from my kit bag and began to gently scrape away the surface layer. The soil beneath was looser, darker. After a few careful minutes, my trowel struck something hard. I worked around it, exposing a small, curved fragment. It was a piece of pottery, no larger than my thumb. My fingers traced the raised lines, the smooth, cool surface. This wasn't local earthenware. This wasn't even medieval European. It was anachronistic, wildly out of place in this English soil, a jarring note in a carefully composed historical narrative. Or something like it. This fragment was a breadcrumb leading to a much larger loaf, one baked in a different time, a different land. As I bagged the fragment, the crunch of gravel announced an unwelcome arrival. A patrol vehicle, its engine idling softly, pulled up a short distance away. The local sheriff, a broad man with a perpetually furrowed brow, stepped out. His expression was tight, his posture stiff. "Still at it, Seth?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "Thought you'd be wrapping things up by now. The official report is due. Accidental fall. Clear cut." "There are details, Sheriff, that aren't so clear cut," I replied, gesturing vaguely towards the disturbed earth. "And I found this." I held up the evidence bag, showing him the pottery shard. "Kids playing, perhaps. Or some antique dropped. This estate's full of them." He dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Look, Seth, the family wants this done. The district attorney's office is keen to close the books. We've got resources stretched thin as it is. We can't keep a full team on an accident." "It's not an accident, Sheriff." "Not anymore," I stated, my voice firm. "There's evidence of recent, unauthorized digging here. And this fragment. It doesn't belong." He sighed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. "Your expertise is invaluable, Seth, truly. But sometimes, a fall is just a fall. You're making things complicated." The unspoken warning hung heavy in the damp air. He wasn't just advising me, he was telling me to back off. Someone, higher up, was definitely applying pressure. I left the estate, the sheriff's words echoing in my mind, a sour taste on my tongue. The anachronistic fragment felt like a hot coal in my evidence bag, burning through the sheriff's dismissive logic. I drove straight back to the university, my mind racing through possible connections, historical anomalies, and Finch's cryptic notes. The lock, a sturdy deadbolt I'd installed myself, was intact. But the subtle scent of ozone, often associated with electrical discharge, lingered faintly in the air, a scent that shouldn't be there. My internal alarm bells began to clang. I flicked on the lights. Nothing appeared overtly disturbed. My microscope sat covered on its bench, the chromatograph silent in the corner. Then I noticed it. The small, locked cabinet where I kept my most sensitive case files was slightly ajar, not forced, but clearly unlatched. I approached cautiously, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy lead paperweight on my desk. Inside, the files were meticulously organized, as always. Nothing seemed to be missing. No papers scattered, no drawers rifled. But my case file on Finch, specifically the folder containing my initial analysis of his remains and the initial scene photos, was not where I'd left it. It was on top of the stack, not beneath the others. And the small, hand-drawn map Finch had tucked into his pocket, the one with the cryptic symbols I'd been trying to decipher, was no longer folded neatly within its plastic sleeve. It lay flat, slightly creased in a new spot. They hadn't taken anything. They hadn't ransacked the place for valuables. They had come for information, and they had left a message. Someone knew I was closing in, knew what I was looking for. My lab wasn't a sanctuary anymore, it was a target. The warning from the detective had settled in my gut like a cold stone. He wasn't just advising me, he was making it clear that I was treading on ground he considered off-limits. But the anachronistic details, the chipped fragment of pottery, they weren't shadows. They were solid, tangible clues. I couldn't ignore them, not if I wanted to look myself in the mirror. The air inside was perpetually chilled, thick with the antiseptic tang of disinfectant and something deeper, more organic, a scent that never quite left the lining of your nostrils. It was a place of quiet contemplation for me, a space where the finality of life and the intricate puzzles of the human body converged. I laid the pottery fragment carefully on a clean tray, its rough edges catching the stark light. It was small, no bigger than my thumbnail, but its texture and the faint, almost imperceptible glaze spoke volumes. I'd arranged for a preliminary assessment with the university's artifact conservator, a woman whose hands were as steady as her gaze was sharp. He arrived a few minutes later, him lab coat crisp, a pair of magnification goggles perched on his forehead. "Seth," he greeted, his voice hushed, respecting the solemnity of the facility. "What have you got for me today?" I gestured to the fragment. "From the Finch estate. He was found near the body." She picked it up with tweezers, moving it under a powerful microscope. Her fingers, accustomed to handling delicate relics, were precise. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the soft click of her adjustments and the distant whir of the facility's ventilation system. I watched her profile, noting the slight furrow in her brow as she peered through the lens. Finally, she pulled back, shaking her head slowly. "Remarkable," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "The craftsmanship is exquisite. It mimics a specific Aegean civilization, late Bronze Age. The mineral inclusions in the clay, the firing temperature, the pigment composition. It's all textbook. The consistency across all parameters. It's like someone perfectly reverse-engineered the ancient methods. But there are microscopic anomalies. a binding agent in the glaze that wasn't available then. Trace elements in the clay that point to a modern quarry, cleverly blended to appear ancient. And the wear pattern. It's artificial. Someone spent a fortune to make this appear genuine, down to the cellular level. This isn't for the casual collector. This is meant to fool the most discerning eye, perhaps even national museums. The pieces began to click into place, a grim mosaic forming in my mind. Finch wasn't just researching ancient artifacts, he was likely investigating the illicit trade of them. And not just any illicit trade, a sophisticated, high-stakes forgery ring operating at the pinnacle of the antiquities market. The fall, the strange details, the warning from the detective. It wasn't about a simple accident. It was about silencing someone who knew too much. Finch hadn't been a victim of a tragic accident. He had been a threat. If this was a forgery, then Finch's death had a far more dangerous implication than I first imagined. My previous search had been through the lens of a historian's accidental death. The air, usually damp and quiet, seemed to hum with unspoken secrets. The caretaker, a taciturn man who rarely spoke more than a few words, let me in without a question, his eyes just as unreadable as before. Finch's study was exactly as I'd left it, a mausoleum of knowledge. Sunlight, now higher in the sky, streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I approached the mahogany desk, running my fingers over the smooth, cool surface. My eyes scanned the shelves, not for books on ancient cultures, but for anything out of place, anything that hinted at a hidden agenda. I ran my hand along the spines of the leather-bound tomes, a systematic search. Most were exactly as they appeared, ancient texts, historical analyses. But then, midway along a shelf dedicated to the archaeology of the Near East, my fingers brushed against a volume that felt different. It was a replica, a beautifully crafted dummy book, its spine perfectly matching the others, but its weight was wrong. Lighter. I pulled it out. I pressed along the line, exploring. My breath hitched. Finch had known. He'd hidden something here. Inside the small, deep compartment, nestled on a velvet lining, were two items. One was a slim, metal-cased portable drive, its surface cool beneath my fingertips. The other was a sheet of aged parchment, folded multiple times. I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't a historical map. It was a modern topographical map, but overlaid with a series of cryptic symbols and notations in a strange, angular script I didn't recognize. Lines connected points, forming an intricate web across the landscape, and a single, bold red X marked a remote, isolated location deep within a mountain range I knew well. Finch hadn't just been researching. He had been tracking. And whatever he had found, whatever secrets were locked away on that drive and encoded on this map, they were deadly enough to get him killed. I had stumbled into something far deeper, far more perilous, than a simple academic dispute. The game had just changed. I wasn't here for the usual occupants. My workstation, a temporary island of cutting-edge hardware, was set up on a stainless steel counter against one wall, surrounded by the quiet, clinical efficiency of the place. The facility offered unparalleled security and environmental control, perfect for handling delicate digital evidence and the few physical fragments I'd managed to salvage from the estate. The confiscated laptop, its shell scarred but its internal drive intact, was connected to my forensic decryption rig. Finch had used a complex, multi-layered encryption scheme, a digital fortress designed to repel all but the most dedicated assault. But I was nothing if not dedicated. Hours blurred into a relentless assault of algorithms, brute force attempts, and educated guesses based on the fragments of his research I'd already pieced together. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a symphony of rapid clicks and taps, each keystroke a probe into the digital darkness. Then, a flicker. A line of green text on the black terminal screen announced a partial bypass. The first layer peeled back, revealing a directory structure filled with coded file names. It was like finding a secret library, each book title a riddle. I started with the largest files, suspecting they held the most substantial data. The initial dump was a jumble of alphanumeric strings, but my decryption software began to sift through the noise, slowly reconstructing fragments of text, images, and what looked like geographical coordinates. The coded map was even more challenging. It wasn't a simple cipher. Finch had incorporated historical cartography techniques, layering modern satellite imagery with archaic symbols and annotations that seemed to predate standardized mapping conventions. I cross-referenced the symbols with obscure texts from my own collection, delving into forgotten languages and ancient sigils. It took another 2 hours, fueled by strong, black coffee from a thermos, before a pattern emerged. The symbols weren't just decorative, they were markers for specific locations, often overlaid on properties of significant historical value across multiple continents. As the encrypted files yielded more coherent data, a chilling picture began to form. They weren't just financial ledgers or shipping manifests. There were detailed profiles of individuals, not just collectors, but philanthropists, academics, and even political figures, all linked by a shared interest in antiquities. The word patron appeared frequently, alongside large sums of untraceable currency. These weren't petty criminals moving forged pottery, this was a sophisticated, deeply entrenched network, operating with impunity at the highest echelons of society. Then, the terms began to surface. The legacy and the keepers. At first, I dismissed them as internal code names, part of Finch's eccentric investigative style. But their recurrence, embedded in different files and across various contexts, suggested something far more profound. The legacy was consistently associated with objects described not merely as valuable, but as foundational, sacred, or truth-bearing. These weren't just any genuine artifacts, they were items deemed crucial to specific historical narratives, often contradicting established academic consensus. The keepers were the guardians of this legacy. Not just custodians, but active manipulators. The files hinted at their influence in academic circles, their ability to fund or suppress research, to shape public perception of historical events. There were mentions of curated narratives and controlled revelations. It wasn't just about making money from fake artifacts, it was about controlling what was known, what was believed, about the past. They weren't just trading history, they were writing it. My breath hitched. This was far beyond a simple forgery ring. Finch hadn't stumbled onto a black market, he'd uncovered an ideological war waged through history itself. The anachronistic details I'd found on the victim's body, the subtle falsifications in the estate's collection, suddenly coalesced into a terrifying coherence. They weren't just mistakes, they were messages, subtle misdirections designed to reinforce a particular, manufactured version of history. I was no longer just an anthropologist examining remains. I was an accidental witness to a meticulously crafted deception spanning centuries. The fragments of data on my screens were just the opening pages of a history I was now compelled to rewrite, even if it meant confronting those who sought to control it. The stakes were no longer just Finch's life, but the integrity of history itself. I wasn't here for the usual occupants. My workstation, a temporary island of cutting-edge hardware, was set up on a stainless steel table pushed against the far wall. The faint, clinical scent of disinfectants couldn't entirely mask the deeper, more organic tang of preservation chemicals that permeated the space. It was a place designed for meticulous study, a quiet sanctuary for the dead to teach the living, and today, it served my purpose perfectly. Under the harsh glare of the microscope's LED, the minute particles of dust I'd painstakingly collected from the historian's clothes, his shoes, and even embedded in the faint abrasions on his skin, shimmered. My initial field tests had indicated a unique mineral composition, unlike anything typical of the estate's immediate geology. Now, with the university's sophisticated Raman spectrometer and electron microscope, I could confirm it. Layers of silicate, mixed with trace elements of manganese and iron, all bound within a crystalline structure indicative of intense pressure and heat. This wasn't just dirt, it was processed earth, pulverized from a specific, geologically rare vein. My fingers flew across the keyboard, cross-referencing the spectral data against geological databases. Most matches were deep earth mining operations, remote regions, or protected sites. But one cluster of entries kept surfacing, less about active mining and more about historical geological surveys, often linked to ancient quarries or natural caves. Dr. Finch, I recalled, had been a historian with an unusual fascination for specific geological formations and their role in ancient societies. He'd published a few obscure papers on the subject years ago, focusing on the cultural significance of certain mineral deposits. I packed away my samples, the data saved and backed up. The dust wasn't an anachronism in itself, but its presence on the historian, far from any known source, certainly was. It was a signature, a geographical fingerprint. The question wasn't what it was, but how it got there, and why it was being concealed. This wasn't a random fall. It was a meticulously staged event, and this dust was the killer's oversight. My next move was clear. Finch had a mentor, a retired curator known for his encyclopedic knowledge of arcane history and his quiet, almost reclusive life since leaving the university. If anyone could shed light on Dr. Finch's more esoteric interests, or perhaps the true nature of his research, it would be the curator. I found the retired curator in a small, cluttered house on the outskirts of the city, nestled amongst overgrown rose bushes and a leaning picket fence. Bookshelves sagged under the weight of countless volumes, creating narrow canyon paths through the living room. Finch spoke highly of your work. Said you had a knack for seeing what others missed. I explained my findings, carefully omitting the more dangerous implications, focusing on the unusual mineral dust and my belief that Dr. Finch's death was no accident. I watched his face closely as I spoke, seeing a flicker of something, fear or recognition, in his eyes when I mentioned the unique geological signature. You're delving into waters far deeper than you understand. My boy, the curator said, setting his teacup down with a clatter. Finch. He always had a way of finding the uncomfortable truths. That dust, you say? Specific composition? I nodded. Very specific. And not from the estate grounds. He sighed, a long, weary sound. Finch was researching something he called the Keepers. A society, ancient in its roots, but very much alive. They believe certain artifacts, certain truths, are too dangerous for public consumption. They control archaeological finds, historical narratives, for political and financial gain. They ensure the right history is told, and the wrong history remains buried. My internal compass spun. A secret society. It sounded like something out of a pulp novel, yet the curator spoke with such conviction, such quiet dread. And Dr. Finch was investigating them? More than investigating, the curator corrected, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He believed they were tied to a specific lineage, a legacy they were desperately trying to preserve. He was convinced they operated out of a private estate, one known for its unique geological features, specifically, a complex of ancient underground tunnels and a vein of minerals they've been exploiting for centuries, not for profit, but for some ceremonial purpose. He paused, then looked me dead in the eye. Finch was obsessed with the Blackwood estate. He believed they were the modern-day custodians of this legacy, and the source of their power lay beneath their very feet. The name clicked into place. The Blackwood estate. I had seen it in the geological database, listed as a private holding with restricted access, its underlying geology flagged for its unusual mineral composition, precisely the kind I'd found on the Historian. The anachronistic detail wasn't just the dust, it was the existence of an ancient, powerful organization using it for their own ends. Finch was getting too close, the curator continued, his voice barely audible. He'd found something that would expose them, shatter their carefully constructed narrative. They don't tolerate loose ends, Seth. You need to be careful. Very careful. The warning hung in the air, heavy and palpable. The clutter of the room, the scent of old books, all faded into the background. My mind was already racing, piecing together the fragments. The danger was no longer theoretical, it was a tangible presence, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was now squarely in their sights. It was a cold that wasn't just about temperature, but about the profound finality of what lay within those steel drawers. I moved with a practiced quiet, my footsteps muffled by the heavy rubber soles of my boots on the polished concrete floor. The hum of the refrigeration units was the only sound, a low, constant drone that seemed to swallow all other noise. I wasn't here for the deceased. My objective was far more immediate, far more dangerous. Beneath a specific, rarely accessed dissection table in the far corner, a loose floor tile concealed a small, waterproof container. I'd placed it there weeks ago, a precaution I hadn't known I'd need until the historian's death, until the warning about the keepers. I also retrieved a specialized set of lockpicking tools, their polished steel glinting faintly in the low-wattage emergency lights. This was my proof, my leverage, and my only way forward. My breath plumed in the frigid air. There was no turning back now. The drive to Elias Thorne's estate was a blur of winding country roads, the landscape growing progressively wilder and more isolated with each mile. Thorne's reputation preceded him, a reclusive industrialist, a formidable collector of antiquities, and now, almost certainly, a key player in this unfolding conspiracy. The estate itself was an imposing silhouette against the dying light, a sprawling, anachronistic blend of ancient stone and modern glass, surrounded by what I knew were layers of cutting-edge security. I moved through the undergrowth, a ghost in the deepening twilight, my movements honed by years of navigating treacherous archaeological sites. I bypassed the laser grids and pressure plates with practiced ease, my heart thrumming a steady rhythm against my ribs. The real challenge lay within the main structure. I found an old, disused service entrance, concealed by overgrown ivy, and set to work with the lockpicking tools. The air inside was stale, metallic, and carried a faint, acrid tang I couldn't immediately identify. I moved through the labyrinthine passages, guided by instinct and the faint architectural schematics I'd committed to memory. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing exposed pipes and concrete walls. Then, the scent grew stronger, mixed with the sharp aroma of solvents and something else, something earthy and ancient. It led me to a heavy, reinforced door, unmarked save for a small, almost invisible access panel. The forgery workshop was a marvel of illicit craft. My flashlight swept across rows of specialized equipment, microscopic engraving tools, sophisticated spectrometers, chemical baths, and racks of unfinished pieces. Clay pots, bronze figurines, and papyrus scrolls lay in various stages of completion, some bearing a patina so convincing it defied belief. The acrid tang was the solvent used to strip down genuine artifacts for their material, while the earthy smell came from freshly applied pigments and carefully aged glazes. This wasn't a crude operation, it was a meticulous, high-tech counterfeiting factory, designed to flood the black market with indistinguishable fakes while masking the trade of genuine relics. My stomach twisted with a mixture of disgust and grim satisfaction. I was right. A subtle seam on the far wall, masked by a large, rolling workbench, caught my eye. It wasn't perfectly flush. My fingers traced the outline, discovering a concealed pressure plate disguised as a floor tile. I carefully depressed it, and with a barely audible hiss, a section of the wall slid inward, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. The hidden vault was a breathtaking, horrifying spectacle. Priceless artifacts, genuine beyond any doubt, were displayed on velvet-lined shelves. Sumerian tablets, Egyptian funerary masks, Roman bronzes, and pre-Columbian gold, all objects that belonged in museums, in the public eye, not hidden away in a private collector's illicit stronghold. These weren't fakes, these were the real things, stolen from legitimate archaeological sites, their histories erased, their cultural significance reduced to a private hoard. This was the keeper's true enterprise. Not from within the vault, but from the workshop. My head snapped around. A small, red light pulsed above the main entrance to the workshop, followed by another, and another, along the ceiling. Thorne's advanced security system had me. I tripped an internal sensor, perhaps a thermal one, or a motion detector I hadn't anticipated. A loud, piercing alarm blared, echoing through the confined space, instantly followed by the rapid thud of heavy footsteps approaching from the corridor. Adrenaline surged through me, sharp and electrifying. I slammed the vault door shut, the mechanism groaning in protest, and scrambled back through the workshop. The footsteps were closer now, heavy and purposeful. I could hear voices, muffled but urgent. My escape route through the service entrance was miles away in the labyrinthine corridors. I spotted a ventilation shaft near the ceiling, barely wide enough, but my only option. With a desperate leap, I grabbed the grate, tearing it loose with a wrench of my body. The shaft was tight, constricting, but it led somewhere, anywhere. Away from the approaching security detail. I heard the crash of the workshop door being forced open below me, shouts echoing up into the shaft. They were in the room. I could feel the vibrations of their heavy boots on the floor beneath me as I crawled, blindly, toward an unknown exit. The game had just changed. I cut the engine a mile from the estate's perimeter fence, plunging the immediate vicinity into an unnerving silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. I watched for an hour, the moonlight painting the ancient trees in shades of gray. Nothing. No movement, no lights beyond the faint glow of the main house. But the stillness was a lie. I felt it, a profound wrongness. I wasn't just investigating a death, I was disturbing an est. My gut tightened. I couldn't risk revealing my presence, not yet. The evidence needed to speak first, loudly and unequivocally. I needed a secure space, a place where sterile precision could strip away the layers of deception. The facility's heavy steel door hissed open, then sealed behind me with a solid thud, severing me from the outside world. The low hum of the refrigeration units was a constant, almost comforting drone in the sterile air. Rows of stainless steel units gleamed under the fluorescent lights, each holding its silent occupant. I moved to one of the smaller, isolated examination rooms, a space usually reserved for delicate dissections or specialized tissue analysis. I locked the inner door, then pulled the blinds down over the narrow, high window. I laid out my equipment on a steel table, a portable microscope, forensic light sources, tweezers, sterile collection bags, and my laptop. From my evidence kit, I carefully unpacked the items I'd managed to secure during my last illicit visit to Thorne's estate: microsamples of soil, fibers from a specific rug, a few discarded cigar ash fragments, and most crucially, a series of high-resolution photographs I'd taken. These weren't the official crime scene photos, but my own, focusing on details the initial investigators had overlooked, or perhaps chosen to ignore. First, the soil. I placed a minute sample from Thorne's study under the microscope, comparing it to the trace amounts I'd painstakingly scraped from the soles of Finch's shoes and the hem of his trousers. The specific mineral composition, the unique crystalline structure of the quartz grains, the presence of certain rare earth elements, they matched. Not just generally, but with an eerie precision that spoke of direct contact. Thorne's study, a room filled with ancient, uncatalogued artifacts, wasn't just a place of quiet contemplation, it was a crucible for this specific kind of geological signature. The soil didn't just suggest Finch had been there, it suggested a struggle, a disturbance that had dislodged these unique particles. Next, the fibers. Under the scope, its distinctive weave and dye pattern emerged. I cross-referenced it with the images I'd captured of Thorne's favorite, threadbare tweed jacket. A perfect match. Finch hadn't simply fallen, he'd been in close, physical contact with Thorne. The official narrative of a tragic accident on a treacherous path crumbled under the weight of this microscopic evidence. I worked methodically, the hours blurring into a focused intensity. Each piece of evidence, once isolated, now began to interlock, forming an intricate, undeniable tapestry. The cigar ash fragments, collected from a hidden alcove in Thorne's study, contained trace elements that matched a rare, expensive brand I knew Thorne favored. Finch, a non-smoker, wouldn't have carried it. More importantly, the ash was mixed with minute flakes of the same ancient clay found on some of the uncatalogued artifacts in Thorne's private collection, artifacts that hinted at the keeper's true interest. Then came the photographs. I projected them onto a large screen, cycling through the detailed shots of Thorne's study, his private vault, and the peculiar symbols etched into the base of certain artifacts. One image, in particular, resonated. It showed a small, unassuming bronze figurine, its base encrusted with a distinct, reddish-brown patina. In an earlier photo, taken during my initial, sanctioned visit, I'd noticed a similar, almost imperceptible stain on the cuff of Finch's shirt, dismissed then as mere dirt. Now, comparing the two side by side, the unique coloration and granular texture were identical. Finch hadn't just stumbled upon the conspiracy, he'd gotten his hands dirty, perhaps literally, trying to expose it. They were real, and Thorne was at their core. The anachronistic details, the minute discrepancies I'd found early on, now screamed their true meaning. Finch hadn't died by accident. He'd been murdered, meticulously framed to appear as a fall, his connection to the illicit trade of artifacts and the Keeper's conspiracy violently severed. I synthesized everything into a concise, damning report, complete with magnified images, spectral analyses, and cross-reference data points. The digital file was robust, unassailable. I had the truth, but the truth was a dangerous weapon, and I was holding it alone. The local authorities, potentially compromised, would be a minefield. I knew this presentation wasn't just about justice for Finch, it was about my own survival. The first rays of dawn were beginning to filter through the high window blinds. Time was running out. I cut the engine a mile from the perimeter fence, the silence amplifying the chirping crickets. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I checked my Sig Sauer, tucked snugly against my ribs. Tonight, I was playing a different kind of scientist. My plan was simple, brutal even, force Thorne's hand. I couldn't go to the authorities with whispers of stolen antiquities and a secret society. I needed irrefutable proof, something Thorne couldn't bury under his wealth and influence. It was a gamble, leaving the estate. I pictured Dr. Finch's face, the vacant stare in his lifeless eyes. He deserved justice, even if it meant risking everything. Not from the night air, but from the grim purpose that drove me. The air around it reeked of formaldehyde. The lock on the back door was a joke. 2 minutes with a tension wrench and it clicked open. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the cloying sweetness of preservatives. Rows of stainless steel drawers stretched into the dimness, each holding a silent testament to mortality. I moved quickly, my flashlight beam dancing over the labels. I knew which drawer I was looking for: unidentified mail, accession date, date of Finch's death. Finding it felt like a punch to the gut. I pulled the drawer open, the metal screeching in protest. There he was. Dr. Finch. His skin was waxy, his features distorted by the embalming process, but I recognized the distinctive mole on his left cheek. I ignored the wave of nausea and focused on the task at hand. I needed evidence, something concrete to link Thorne to Finch's death. My eyes scanned his body, searching. Then I saw it, a faint discoloration on his right wrist, a subtle bruising pattern hidden beneath the folds of his skin. Carefully, I peeled back the skin, using a scalpel from my kit. There, embedded in the subcutaneous tissue, was a tiny fragment of metal. I extracted it with tweezers, placing it in a sterile vial. It was the same alloy I'd found in the antique knife at the estate, the one used to kill Doctor. That was all I needed. As I was about to close the drawer, a noise echoed from the hallway, a muffled footstep. My blood turned to ice. I killed my flashlight and crouched behind a row of drawers, my Sig Sauer raised. "Hello," a voice called out, laced with suspicion. His face was grim. "Thorne is slippery, Seth." I knew Thorne wouldn't take this lying down. He'd come after me, after anyone who threatened his precious legacy. That wasn't right. The detective and I exchanged a look. This was it. We approached the main house cautiously, guns drawn. The front door was ajar. Around him stood several men, all armed, all wearing the same grim expression. The keepers. I was wondering when you'd show your face, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. You've become a nuisance, Seth, Thorne sneered. A regrettable complication. But all complications can be eliminated. You murdered Dr. One I can no longer afford. The detective moved beside me, his gun trained on Thorne. It's over, Thorne. Just give up. It's never over, Thorne hissed. The keepers will endure. Our legacy will live on. He raised his pistol, aiming directly at me. My gamble. My last stand. I took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. The room seemed to shrink, the air growing heavy, as Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger. Thorne's finger twitched. A sharp crack ripped through the air, deafening in the confined space. I didn't wait. The instant his muscles tensed, I launched myself forward, not at him, but to the side, rolling clumsily behind a stack of crates filled with dusty, labeled archives. Splinters flew as a bullet tore into the wood where I'd stood a second before. The acrid scent of gunpowder stung my nostrils. Stay down, Seth. The shout came from the doorway, followed by the heavy thud of tactical boots. A team of federal investigators, led by the lead investigator, surged into the room, weapons raised. Thorne, startled by their sudden appearance, spun, his pistol tracking. He managed to get off another wild shot before a stun grenade erupted with a blinding flash and a concussive blast that rattled my teeth. When my vision cleared, Thorne was on the ground, groaning, his weapon skittering across the flagstones. The lead investigator knelt beside him, securing his wrists with zip ties. The air hung thick with the smell of ozone and burned powder. My ears rang, but the tension, a constant companion for days, began to bleed out of me, leaving behind a profound emptiness. The next few days were a blur of debriefings, evidence cataloging, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing pieces fall into place. Thorne's capture triggered a cascade. His communications devices, meticulously analyzed, laid bare the intricate web of his operations. The stolen artifacts, precisely as I'd predicted, were found hidden within the estate's sprawling cellars, carefully packed for transport. Each piece, from the Mycenaean dagger to the Phoenician statuettes, was a testament to the historian's meticulous records and Thorne's avarice. The true revelation, however, came from the decrypted files on Thorne's encrypted drive. There, meticulously documented, was the history of the Keepers, not just a clandestine network of artifact traffickers, but a centuries-old brotherhood dedicated to preserving what they deemed lost knowledge, often at any cost. They weren't just selling relics, they were selectively hoarding, suppressing, and sometimes destroying anything that threatened their curated version of history. The prominent historian's death wasn't just about a valuable piece he refused to part with, it was about preventing him from exposing the true scope of their manipulation. The anachronistic details I'd found, the subtle signs of a struggle, the precise placement of the body, all pointed to a carefully staged act designed to silence a scholar who knew too much. The truth, ugly and complex, finally surfaced. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting long, sterile shadows over the stainless steel tables. My breath plumed in front of me. I had requested a final review of the prominent historian's remains. Not because I expected to find anything new, but because I needed to bring the story full circle. The attendant, a quiet man with kind eyes, pulled out the tray. The sheet was crisp white. I peeled it back slowly, revealing the still form beneath. The injuries were familiar now, etched into my memory. The precise fracture patterns, the subtle bruising, the minute traces of a fibrous material I'd identified as a specific type of antique rope, all the silent witnesses to a violent end. My initial findings had been correct, every single one. The fall had been a lie. I ran a gloved finger along the clean edge of a clavicle, tracing the line of a hairline fracture. Justice had been served, at least for this man, but the cost. The emotional landscape of the past weeks was a wasteland. The violence, the deceit, the casual disregard for human life and historical integrity. It left a residue, a grimy film over my senses. Here, everything was quiet, still, and irrevocably final. I looked at the prominent historian's face, peaceful now, freed from the machinations of the keepers. He had died fighting for truth, and in a way, I had finished his fight. My role, I realized, was shifting. It wasn't just about the bones, the earth, the silent stories of the past. It was about the living, breathing conspiracy that sought to distort those stories, to weaponize history itself. My meticulous science, my eye for the anachronism, my relentless pursuit of the minute detail, these were not just academic tools. They were weapons against deception. I thought about the future. The quiet contemplation of archaeological sites, the methodical excavation of ancient secrets, that still called to me. But a new path had opened, one that intertwined the past with the dangerous present. The thrill of the chase, the intellectual sparring with those who sought to bury truth, the tangible impact of my work in exposing injustice, it was a potent draw. The world of forensic investigation was far broader, far more perilous, than I had ever fully acknowledged. I had stood on the precipice of death, looked into the eyes of a man who would kill to protect a lie, and I had not flinched. Perhaps, I thought, this was where I truly belonged. My hand tightened into a fist, a silent promise to the quiet form on the table. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find its way to the light. And I would be there to help guide it.